Hello, my name is Rob Grant and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture in the Economic Policy Analysis series. And the topic today is grassroots capitalism, which is about entrepreneurs and SMEs in developing economies. So, first of all, we'll have a quick introduction in this first video, and in subsequent videos we'll look at these areas. So, entrepreneurs and MSE growth. We'll look at the characteristics of entrepreneurs, by which I mean the people that start and run their own businesses, and then the factors that influence how these grow and the importance of these things growing in the economy. After that, we look at some questions of regulation, the way that policy can influence the development of businesses or hinder it, and the particular question of where enterprises are concentrated in the informal sector and the implications of that. The next video broadens that out to look at the wider environments within which private sector and economic and firm development has to take place in different countries. And then the final topic is the specific question of family businesses, when family and kinship networks become important for business. And then we have some conclusions. But before we get started with that, we'll have an introduction section. So, going back now to the 1960s. And in the 1960s, just off the coast of Bangladesh, there was a violent storm, the Bangladesh cyclone, which you can look up, in which more than 10,000 people were thought to have lost their lives. Around about 500,000 or so homes were destroyed by the flooding. And the crew of this ship found themselves, once the storm subsided, marooned in the middle of just paddy fields. A long way in from the coast, and of course there's no way they could get back, so it was marooned there. So that was 1961, and then later in that year it was sold to the East Bengal Trading Corporation, but they couldn't do anything with it. They just bought this wreck, and it stayed there for many years, and over about a decade, people living in the area gradually started going on board and just informally taking away bits and pieces and dismantling it. And over a decade or so, the whole thing was just taken apart by local people and sold for scrap and reused and recycled. And then you get into the 70s, and in the 70s there was the war between East and West Pakistan, as it was in those days, and of course East Pakistan became modern Bangladesh. In the aftermath of that war, several other ships were also washed up, marooned, on the coast of this area of what was then Bangladesh, near Chittagong, and those also were salvaged gradually by local people and broken apart. And this gradually became more foremost. By the time we got to the 1980s, there were deals being done when then people would come and deliberately beach the ships and sell them as scrap, and then locals who were then getting into the trade then in a more organised way would then disintegrate the whole ships and sell them back for scrap and recycling. So that was from the 60s to the 80s, people gradually doing that. And then we get to where we are now, which is by 2010, about 200 ships a year, mostly big ships, are broken up. And it stretches along about 20 kilometres of the coast near Chittagong. And you can see it, even without magnification, you can see it from space. It's a colossal set of enterprises now. And it's become quite famous in other ways as well, almost a landmark. It's appeared in several films, Indian films and Western films. By 2010, there are 120 workshops spread along these 20 kilometres of the coast. They're breaking about 200 ships a year, about a fifth of the world total. And about 200,000 people are now employed directly, almost all in the informal sector, of course, with also employment generated in banks and things as well, but mostly in the informal sector, and mostly also a big role for family relationships and kinship ties, as we'll see later on. As we'll also say later on, there's lots of links between this area and the capital Dhaka and elsewhere in Bangladesh. We're going to go back to this study at the end, because in this study you see a lot of things, a lot of the themes which I'm going to talk about in the rest of the lecture really come together in this case study. So we'll come back to this at the end in a bit more detail. But that all started with this one cyclone and one ship being washed up in the 1960s. So more broadly then, the question of grassroots capitalism. Well, according to the World Bank 2018 Doing Business report, approximately 90% of employment in developing countries is in the private sector. So a smaller role for the public sector than you get in a more developed economy. So this is private sector firms, which can be anything from huge enterprises down to just one person selling chapatis or working as a tailor. But some, which you find anywhere, but one of the characteristics that people have often identified in developing economies is this idea of a missing middle. That if you drew a graph of the distribution from the smaller firms up to the bigger firms, you find that instead of a smooth pattern, there are loads and loads and loads of small firms, then a bit of a gap with fewer in the middle, and then a few bigger firms. And this has been a puzzle, because obviously the broader context of this is, if you want a thriving private sector to develop, you want people to be starting a lot of small firms, the firms to grow, gradually increase in size, employ more people, produce more outputs, win-win situation. But if there's some sort of problem whereby the smaller firms never grow and there's a missing middle, then there's a blockage somewhere to that happening. More recently, people looking again at the data have debated whether or not that really exists. Is it really an artifact? And if you look on the reading list, the economists say is claiming that perhaps this is just an artifact of the way you measure it. So if you measure it in terms of output of firms or the number of people employed by firms, you don't quite see this jump. If you measure it in terms of, I think, employment share, so what's the percentage of employment employed in the smallest firms, the middle-sized firms, and the biggest firms, and you put it into those three quite chunky categories, then it dips down. So it doesn't go up smoothly. A lot of people employed in the smallest firms, quite a lot of people employed percentage-wise in the biggest firms, and not a big percentage in the middle. So it looks like there's a gap. If you graph it in other ways, just looking at the output or the number of the total size of each firm, you get a smoother pattern. But what you do definitely get is a heavy skew to smaller firms compared to what you get in the more developed economy. So proportionally, it seems clear that there are many more much smaller micro firms in less developed, poorer, if you like that, to put it that way, economies. And then, if you look at, in terms of development, in terms of increasing economic sophistication and development, then you get a decline in that skewness. So gradually the distribution shifts up towards the bigger firms. Some more facts that seem to be supported by the evidence is that MSE productivity is smaller than larger firms, both in terms of output per worker and output per worker per hour and per unit of capital. And the gap between the productivity is biggest in the small countries. So in all countries, bigger firms tend to be more productive, and there's a gap, but the gap is bigger in the poorest economies. So that element of missing middle sort of is there in the poorer countries. And also we find that where an economy has proportionally higher number of MSEs, that same country tends to have lower wages, as you'd expect, if you believe that wages are driven by marginal product of labour, and also total factor productivity. So the raw materials, the capital, the land and stuff you're putting in is less productive in the MSE sector in poorer countries, because not necessarily in bigger countries with such a gap. One thing I should mention here is this term, because this may confuse some people. If you're being eagle-eyed, you notice that we've got MSE here, which is micro and small enterprises. So that's like 1 person, 5 up to 10, 15, depending on different definitions, maybe up to 20 or 50 in some definitions. But the one that I used in the title of the lecture, and sometimes in this lecture, is SME, which is small and medium-sized enterprises. That's going up to 50 or 100, depending on definitions. So small and medium covers a slightly larger spread of enterprises. A lot of what I'm talking about here is MSEs, micro and small enterprises, but if we're concerned with how they grow, what we're talking about, how do those micro and small enterprises graduate up to the medium size, the SME sector. So we're looking at the relationship between these things, really. So we'll be looking at some of the arguments for why MSEs don't graduate up to the medium and then the large firm size. Broadly speaking, there are 2 sets of arguments. There's the legalist arguments, which are really where the people are talking about the missing middle argument, is that there are some sort of legal barriers about specific to the way that firms are taxed or regulated that make a barrier or align incentives so that there are reasons why firms don't grow into that middle area. But what can sometimes be called a more structuralist view is that no, in actual fact, it's just part of general capitalist development. Other factors that explain the differences in economic development between different countries also explain the reasons why you have this more continuous distribution of firm sizes and the difference that gradually changes from the less developed to the more developed economies, rather than it being specifically about a set of regulations aimed at small firms. We'll come back to that later. Okay, so this is maybe a useful schematic to bear in mind when we're listening to this lecture, thinking about what are the different factors and processes we're talking about. So a simple picture here is that we've got the ultimate aim is to increase two things: employment to generate jobs for people, and production to produce benefits for society in terms of goods and so on. So what we have to start with is, well, the two inputs really is resources and people. So resources, or the capital, the raw materials, land and so on, and then people are a very special resource. And the stages are startup. So you need you need first of all to get some companies to start up and be formed, and then some of those companies at least have got to grow and expand in terms of how many people they employ, how much output they produce, and then from that growth you hope to expand those final two things. So an obvious number one problem when you look at this is, okay, it's a poor country, it hasn't got enough resources, and obviously that's going to be part of the story. But evidence shows it's not just that poor countries have fewer resources, particularly capital, though it is a constraint. Other things could be the trained people, the sufficient trained human resources. And as the Peruvian economist De Soto argues, who's on the reading list as well, his book Mystery of Capital, he argues that in actual fact poor countries and poor people do have capital, but because in his case he's arguing that property rights are weak, that capital can't be put to work in the same way it can be put to work in a more developed economy. So whether or not you go with that particular argument about property rights, it seems clear that, or the argument is clear that we need to look beyond the simple question of, okay, how many inputs have we got and how technically efficient is our production, to the broad environment in each country within which this development is happening. So that's what we'll do in the different stages of the lecture today. Okay, so that's the introduction. I'll stop the video here so they don't get too long. In the next video we'll go on to look at entrepreneurs and MSE as opposed to SME growth, but there are overlaps. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.